Thank you very much for that, Chair. Dr. Quiggin, the Climate Change Committee assumes that the BECCS facilities capture 90 to 95% of the carbon dioxide emitted. How effective today is BECCS currently at capturing and storing carbon emissions? And to what extent is there, contained within that answer, presumably, there's a trade-off between almost the amount of power generated and the percentage of carbon emissions, i.e. if you produce, you could game the stacks, so to speak, if you only produce a small amount of power, perhaps, or... So could you just give the committee a sense as to how effective BECCS is in those terms?
Sure. I think it's really important to say that obviously there are a lot of commercial interests in the development of CCS, and particularly CCS in relation to BECCS. So there's a lot of R&D trials that are being done that have not published into the public domain. So it's quite difficult, sat behind the wrong side of the paywall, as it were, to truly understand how effective it is. Theoretically, it's possible to capture 90-95% of the emissions. The issue becomes, as thermodynamics tells us, that separating a diffuse gas from a diffuse gas requires lots of energy. And essentially what CCS does in post-combustion capture, and there are different types of CCS, is to use a solvent to bind the CO2 molecules to that solvent, and then you have to apply heat to the solvent to then release the CO2 such that you compress it, pipe it, transport it, put it underground. The question becomes, how much heat do you need to put in to that solvent to release that CO2 such that you can capture it? And where does that heat come from? You're diverting heat away from the biomass that you've burnt, which would otherwise turn water into steam to generate your electricity, and rather you're diverting some of that heat to your CCS process. Exactly how much gets diverted is still in the R&D phase, and we don't know what that energy penalty will be. And I can refer you back to the comments that I gave, or the evidence that I gave at the EAC back last year as to what I thought that energy penalty would be. At the time, I calculated it based on a report produced by Beringa, commissioned by Drax, to be around about 15 percentage points. So if you do the maths, basically Drax's power efficiency would fall from around about 36% down to around about 21%. To be fair on Drax, they submitted written evidence to the EAC that contradicted what I was saying, and so they were saying that it was going to fall from around about 40% down to around about 29%. So there's some dispute there. So they're saying an 11% or 11 percentage point fall in power production efficiency. I'm saying around about 15%. Let's sort of let's not worry about the kind of the splitting the hairs there. Lower power revenues will mean a higher cost to the consumer or the taxpayer or an industry participant who wants to buy that negative emission offset. So the question is, are they going to be really costly, these carbon emission offsets, the negative emissions? Because if you've got this big power production fall, then that CO2 being sequestered into the ground that Drax is going to have to charge someone for is going to become more expensive. So Ember did really great work trying to work out what sort of subsidy that Drax may require. I think if I have my memory correct, it's around 31.7 billion over 25 years for BECCS. My understanding of Ember's calculation is that does not include a big energy penalty, a big reduction in power efficiency. So the bigger that reduction in power efficiency, the higher that 31.7 billion is going to go. So yeah, I have grave concerns as to how much this technology is going to cost us when, let's be clear about it, there are other means of doing this, right? So one of the alternatives to BECCS, which I think is incredibly important for us to consider, is lower energy consumption. In the West in particular, we consume so much. We consume so much energy. And at the time when energy prices are rising and rising and rising, surely we need to consider more reducing our demand for energy whilst also decarbonising supply. And that could go a long way to actually meeting that emissions gap. And it wouldn't rely on expensive supply-side technologies that come with all the trade-offs and risks, such as increased food prices and so on and so on. I'll just read you one statement from the IPCC. They say, decent living standards are achievable at lower energy demand than previously thought, high confidence, and exhibit reduced trade-offs and negative consequences for SDGs relative to pathways with high consumption and emissions that are ultimately compensated by large quantities of BECCS.
Okay.
Right, yeah.
Mr. Gardiner, yeah. How effective is BECCS on your own?
I think the best way to respond to to Daniel's points is to sort of focus on sort of how we're going to get to net zero, right? And currently, the world has got a carbon budget remaining to maintain our sort of the planet within 1.5 degrees of about 400 billion tons, right? And that's basically 10 years, given where we're going, right? So actually, I think the world is increasingly recognizing that carbon removal technology is absolutely critical, right? And the two sort of scale possible carbon removal technologies that we've got are direct air capture, right? And I'm not dismissing the biochar space, but it's a smaller, as my colleague has pointed out, is direct air capture, which is extremely expensive, and BECCS, which is significantly less, right? And so you asked the question how confident we are, and I think this also plays importantly into how the business models will work, right? I mean, the expectation we have is that if we end up with a sort of a carbon plus power CFD from the government, which is the business model that's on the table, we will effectively make the investment ourselves in doing this, on the order of $1 billion per unit. And we will effectively get some compensation for that if and when we deliver at that 95% efficiency level, if and when we deliver the megawatt hours of power that we said that we need to deliver. So effectively, the point is that the risk is on the company as opposed to it's on the taxpayer, right? Or the consumer. They will not pay if it doesn't happen, right? If you take where the price of power is today, right? Again, I won't give you the precise numbers because we're in the middle of sort of commercial discussions, but we've submitted our proposal to be a BECCS Track 1 project. But we can deliver a megawatt hour of power, and I think Daniel likes to use the word, penalty, energy penalty. I mean, it does take power to deliver carbon removal, right? At the end of the day, I wouldn't call that a penalty. That's effectively, that's the input cost of delivering something that I think will have very significant
Can I just be clear?
value.
It's not what I call it. It's what academics call it. It's just called the energy penalty.
But the key point for me is that the efficiency effectively sort of implies that it's less efficient, obviously, when actually it's just the fact is that the power is being used for another purpose, right? It's being used to remove the CO2 permanently from the atmosphere and store it underground, right? So to finish my point, I mean, the cost of doing that we estimate is significantly lower than the cost of just generating 1 megawatt hour of power today, right? So effectively you get the power, which is also renewable, and you get the carbon removal as well.
Okay. My last point, simply just to Dr. Quiggin, because I thought, your point was very eloquently and powerfully made. What I would gently say is when you come to energy consumption, when you think of a global basis, we're actually mostly not worried. You're not going to be worried about the West. You're going to be worried about developing countries where their demand is going up at a rate of knots when they've got very high populations. And I'm not talking about China, in fact. China are much further along the curve on this. I'm talking about sub-Saharan Africa, I'm talking about India, other countries. And so that is almost a bigger issue than worrying about, exactly in the West where we're already at a very high level comparatively, would be what I would suggest.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. Yeah, I completely agree. I think it's an incredibly important point that you're making. Even more reason why we have to go further and faster now, which needs to include demand reduction and not rely on future technologies, which may or may not work as effectively as they. Whenever we look into the future, it's always crystal ball gazing, right? I can make a prediction about the future. Drax can make a prediction about the future. Some academic can make a prediction about the future. It's always, to a degree, crystal ball gazing. What we have in our control right now is the ability to deploy solar, deploy wind, manage our demand. And if we're worried about rising consumption and therefore emissions in developing countries, which they should be allowed to industrialise, they should be allowed to have a higher standard of living, then we need to be even more cognizant and focus even more so on our consumption and our emissions now, which is why demand in the West needs to be on the table now. And, you know, it's not a dichotomy. It's not like we do demand reduction now and don't do BECCS in the future. If we do more demand reduction now, more solar, more wind, and look at BECCS, let's see how it develops. But baking in over-reliance is risky. And in my view, quite insane, actually. There's one study that shows that an over-reliance on BECCS, BECCS and other GGRs, let's be fair, could lead to an additional temperature rise of 1.4 degrees just on its own through delayed and deterred efforts now.
Thank you, Chair.
Let me